fat virgin slept with mountain man and ran. Next day, 5 mountain men arrived and a storm howls through the mountains when a lonely hunter opens his cabin door and finds a terrified young woman begging to be let in. One night of mercy turns into a moment of shame, and by sunrise, she's gone. But the next day, 5 hard-riding men appear at his cabin gate, each claiming to be looking for her. One says she's a runaway debtor, another swears she's his promised bride. But when the mountain man learns the truth, he realizes the men aren't after her. They're after something worth killing for. Now, hunted across the frozen wilderness, she must choose between running again or trusting the man who once broke her heart to save her life. Snow burns, rifles roar, and faith is tested in the high country. Because sometimes the wildest thing a man can do is forgive. What secret is this woman carrying? And why are 5 men willing to die to take her back? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wind howled like 1,000 hungry wolves as Ephraim Cade stirred the venison stew simmering in his cast-iron pot. Chunks of deer meat, carrots, and potatoes bobbed in the thick broth, filling his small cabin with the rich aroma of sage and pepper. Outside, the snowstorm raged across the Rocky Mountains, rattling the wooden shutters and whistling through every crack in the logs. Ephraim had weathered countless storms in this one-room shelter, but something about tonight felt different. The air was heavy with more than just snow. He added another log to the pot-bellied stove, watching orange sparks dance up the blackened pipe. His calloused hands, rough from years of trapping and hunting, gripped the wooden spoon as he gave the stew another stir. The pounding at his door came sudden and desperate, nearly causing him to drop the spoon. 3 sharp knocks that barely carried over the storm's fury. Ephraim's hand instinctively moved to the rifle propped against the wall, but something in the frantic rhythm of those knocks held him back. "Please!" A woman's voice, high and frightened, cut through the wind. "Is anyone there? Please help!" Ephraim crossed the creaking floorboards in 4 long strides. The door groaned against the wind as he pulled it open, letting in a swirl of snow and a blast of frigid air that made the lantern flames dance wildly. There on his threshold stood a young woman, soaked to the bone and shivering violently. Her dark hair hung in wet ropes around a plain but earnest face. She clutched a leather-bound hymn book to her chest with one hand and a battered carpet bag with the other. Her dress, once a serviceable brown wool, was torn at the hem and splattered with mud. Her shoes were beyond ruined, barely holding together. "Sir," she managed through chattering teeth, "I don't mean to impose, but I've lost my way in the storm. I only need shelter until morning. Please, I promise I'll be gone at first light." Ephraim stood frozen for a moment, studying her. Years of solitude had made him wary of strangers, but there was something in her eyes, a mix of desperation and determination, that spoke to him. "Come in," he said gruffly, stepping aside. "You'll freeze out there." She stumbled across the threshold, her legs trembling with cold and exhaustion. Without thinking, Ephraim caught her elbow to steady her. She flinched at his touch, but didn't pull away. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching. "I'm Sage Harland." "Ephraim Cade," he replied, closing the door against the howling wind. "Stove's hot. Get yourself warm." Sage moved toward the warmth like a moth to flame, still clutching her precious hymn book. Up close, Ephraim could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe mid-20s, and full-bodied in a way that spoke of honest work rather than idle comfort. Her clothes, though sodden and mud-stained, had once been well made. I've got some dry things you can change into, he said, moving to the trunk where he kept his spare clothes. Won't fit proper, but they're warm. You're very kind, Sage said, her voice steadier now. I don't mean to be a burden. Ephraim pulled out a clean flannel shirt and wool trousers. No burden. Can't leave anybody out in weather like this. He gestured to a rough-hewn privacy screen in the corner. You can change there. I'll fetch some water for washing up. While Sage changed, Ephraim busied himself heating water and adding another portion to the stew. The wolves were calling to each other now, their eerie song carrying over the storm's fury. He noticed Sage's shadow stiffen behind the screen at the sound. They won't come near, he assured her. Not with the fire going. She emerged from behind the screen, swimming in his clothes but looking warmer. Her face had more color now, and she'd managed to braid her damp hair back from her face. The hymn book never left her hands. That book means something to you, Ephraim observed, ladling stew into 2 tin bowls. Sage's fingers tightened around the worn leather. It was my sister's. She stopped, swallowing hard. It's all I have left of her. Thunder cracked overhead, sharp as a rifle shot. Sage jumped, stumbling forward with a small cry. Ephraim moved without thinking, catching her against his chest. For one breathless moment, they stood frozen, her hands gripping his shirt, his arms steadying her shoulders, their faces inches apart. Sage's eyes were wide, the color of summer sage in the lamplight. Something shifted in Ephraim's chest, an emotion he couldn't name stirring to life after years of dormancy. He could feel her heart racing against his palms, smell the lingering scent of rain in her hair. They broke apart quickly, both stepping back as if burned. Sage smoothed down his borrowed shirt with trembling hands, while Ephraim turned, abruptly, to the stove. Best eat while it's hot, he said gruffly, pushing a bowl toward her. Storm's likely to last all night. Sage accepted the bowl with murmured thanks, settling onto the bench by the table. She ate carefully but with obvious hunger, pausing between bites to warm her hands on the tin. This is good, she said softly. I haven't had a proper meal in... She trailed off, staring into the stew as if it held answers to questions she couldn't voice. Ephraim watched her from the corner of his eye as he ate his own portion. There was a story there, in her silences, and the way she startled at sudden sounds. He'd seen that look before, in soldiers' eyes after the war, the look of someone running from something worse than any storm. Where you headed? He asked, keeping his voice neutral. West, she answered after a pause. There's a mission settlement near the Oregon Territory. I have a letter of introduction to the sisters there. Another crack of thunder, closer this time. The cabin walls seemed to shudder with it. Sage set her spoon down carefully, her knuckles white around the bowl. You're safe here, Ephraim found himself saying. Whatever you're running from, it won't find you tonight. Sage's eyes filled suddenly with tears, though none fell. How did you know I was running? Seen it before, he said simply. No shame in it. Sometimes running's the only way to survive. She nodded, pressing her lips together. I didn't want to, but there wasn't any choice left, not after... She stopped again, her hand unconsciously touching her middle, in a gesture that told Ephraim more than words could have. The silence stretched between them, filled with the storm's fury and the pop of burning wood in the stove. Ephraim had lived alone so long, he'd forgotten how another person's presence could fill a room, how it could make the familiar corners of his cabin feel suddenly different, warmer somehow, despite the howling wind outside. You should sleep, he said finally, standing to clear their bowls. Take the bed. I'll make do by the fire. Oh no, I couldn't. You can, and you will. He cut her off, not unkindly. You're dead on your feet, and that floor's harder than it looks. Sage looked like she wanted to argue, but was too exhausted to try. She clutched her hymn book to her chest as she made her way to his narrow bed, lined with warm furs and quilts. "Thank you, Mr. Cade," she said, pausing by the bedside. "Not everyone would have opened their door tonight." "Ephraim," he corrected, "and you don't need to thank me. Just get some rest." He busied himself banking the fire for the night, trying not to notice how right she looked there in his cabin, wrapped in his clothes, her dark hair spilling over his pillow. The storm raged on outside, but in here, in this moment, there was a peace he hadn't felt in years. Sage fell asleep quickly, her breathing evening out into the gentle rhythm of exhaustion finally answered. Ephraim settled, himself by the stove, wrapped in his old army blanket, and watched the shadows dance across the cabin walls. The wolves had gone quiet now, and even the wind seemed to be easing. That moment when she'd fallen into his arms played over in his mind. How long had it been since he'd touched another person? Since he'd felt anything but the familiar weight of solitude? One night, he told himself firmly. She'd be gone by morning, back to whatever path she was following, and his life would return to its quiet routine. But as he drifted off to sleep, lulled by the storm's diminishing fury and the soft sound of Sage's breathing, Ephraim Cade couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in his world. Like the first thaw after a long winter, something was beginning to crack open in his carefully guarded heart. The night deepened around them, the storm gradually spending its fury against the mountains. In the small cabin, two souls who had been running, one from the world, one toward an uncertain future, found a moment of peace in the simple act of shelter shared, of kindness freely given. Whatever morning might bring remained to be seen, but for now, in this space between one life and another, they were safe. Dawn crept over the mountains with gentle fingers, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Inside the cabin, Sage Harland stirred from the deepest sleep she'd known in months. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, savoring the warmth of the furs and quilts around her. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound silence that seemed to hold the world in suspension. Then awareness crashed over her like ice water. She wasn't alone in the bed. Sometime in the night, Ephraim must have moved from his place by the stove. He lay beside her now, fully clothed and on top of the quilts, but still close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His breathing was deep and even, his face softened by sleep in a way that made him look younger, less weathered by solitude. Shame flooded through her, hot and sharp. What kind of woman was she, to share a bed with a stranger? Even if nothing had happened, even if he'd been nothing but kind, she knew how it would look. She could almost hear Reverend Marshall's condemning voice, a fallen woman, beyond redemption. Moving with exquisite care, Sage eased herself from the bed. Ephraim didn't stir. She changed quickly back into her own dress, now dry but still bearing the mud and wear of her journey. Her shoes were still damp, but she forced them onto her feet, biting her lip against their clammy discomfort. Through the cabin's single window, she saw Ephraim's mule in the lean-to shelter, and beyond that, his tall figure moving near the woodpile. He had his rifle with him, probably checking it after the storm. This was her chance. Sage's hands trembled as she gathered her carpet bag. The hymn book lay on the table where she'd set it the night before. She opened it to the page that had brought her comfort through so many dark nights. Whosoever shall believe. The familiar words blurred as tears threatened. Making a swift decision, she carefully tore the page free. She placed it on the table, weighing it down with a tin cup. It was poor payment for such kindness, but it was all she had to give. That and her prayers for the quiet man who'd opened his door to a stranger in the storm. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty cabin, "but I can't stay. I can't risk." Her hand drifted to her middle, where new life stirred beneath her heart. Her sister's child, her promise to keep it safe, to give it a better life than they'd known. She couldn't let anyone or anything jeopardize that promise. The door opened silently on well-oiled hinges. Outside, the morning air bit at her face with sharp teeth, but the sky was clear, a perfect bowl of winter blue. Fresh snow blanketed everything, transforming the wild landscape into something pure and untouched. Sage took a moment to fix the cabin in her memory. The rough-hewn logs, the thin curl of smoke from the chimney, the peace she'd found here, however briefly. Then she turned and walked away, following what looked like a trail leading down into the canyon. Her feet sank into the fresh snow with each step, leaving clear tracks behind her. She knew she should try to hide them, but she didn't know how. And anyway, the important thing was to put distance between herself and the cabin before Ephraim discovered her gone. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft crunch of her footsteps and her labored breathing as she picked her way down the slope. The trail wound between towering pines, their branches still heavy with snow. Occasionally a clump would fall with a soft whump, making her jump. She'd gone perhaps a mile when the first fresh snowflakes began to fall. Back at the cabin, Ephraim finished his morning check of the rifle, a habit ingrained by years of frontier life, and headed inside. The moment he opened the door, he knew something was wrong. The air felt different, emptier somehow. "Miss Harland?" he called softly, though he already knew she wouldn't answer. The bed was empty, the quilts turned back. His clothes from the night before lay neatly folded on the bench. And there on the table, held down by one of his tin cups, was a single page torn from her precious hymn book. Ephraim picked it up with careful fingers, reading the words through twice before their meaning sank in. "Whosoever shall believe." The paper trembled slightly in his hand. Guilt hit him like a physical blow. What must she have thought, waking to find him there beside her? He'd only meant to check on her in the night, worried about her chill from the storm. He must have dozed off, and now she'd fled into the wilderness alone, thinking him no better than the kind of man she was clearly running from. "Fool," he muttered, crumpling the hymn page in his fist before smoothing it out again and tucking it carefully into his shirt pocket. He had to find her, had to explain, had to make sure she was safe. Moving with the efficiency of long practice, Ephraim gathered his gear: rifle, powder horn, water skin, dried meat, and an extra blanket. He shrugged into his heavy coat and stepped outside, where fat snowflakes were beginning to swirl down from laden clouds. The mule snorted a greeting as he approached the lean-to. "Sorry, old friend," Ephraim said, reaching for the saddle. "No rest for us today." He worked quickly, checking the cinch twice before mounting. Her tracks were still clear in the fresh snow, leading down toward the canyon. But the new snow was falling faster now, already starting to blur the edges of her footprints. Ephraim clicked his tongue, urging the mule forward. The animal picked its way carefully down the slope, following Sage's trail. Every so often, Ephraim would spot signs of her passage: a broken twig, a scuff in the snow where she'd slipped, a clear handprint where she'd caught herself against a tree trunk. Each mark made his heart clench tighter. She was alone out here, poorly equipped for the wilderness, clearly exhausted despite her night's rest. And now with more snow falling. He'd seen too many good people lose their way in weather like this. seen how quickly the familiar could become strange and deadly when the snow began to dance. The mule's ears suddenly pricked forward, and Ephraim tensed, scanning the trees. Nothing moved except the falling snow, but years of frontier life had taught him to trust his mount's instincts. Something was out there. He touched the rifle at his side, making sure it was clear in its scabbard. Mountain lions sometimes came down this low when the hunting was poor up high, and the wolves he'd heard last night might still be around. Sage would have no defense against either. The snow fell harder, drawing a white veil across the landscape. Ephraim leaned forward in the saddle, straining to make out her tracks. They were becoming harder to distinguish, filling with fresh powder. Soon they would disappear altogether, leaving him no way to know which way she'd turned. "Lord," he whispered, surprising himself with the prayer. It had been years since he'd addressed the Almighty directly. "Lord, help me find her. Don't let my foolishness cost her life." The wind picked up, driving the snow sideways now. Ephraim pulled his collar higher and pressed on. Somewhere ahead in that swirling whiteness, a young woman walked alone, carrying what he suspected was more than just the burden of her carpet bag. He'd seen how she held herself, noticed the careful way she moved, had recognized the look in her eyes, the fierce, protective determination of someone with more than just their own life to consider. The hymn page crinkled against his chest as he leaned into the wind. "Whosoever shall believe." The words seemed to mock him now. What right did he have to anyone's belief or trust? He'd spent too many years alone, forgotten how to be around people, how to show proper consideration. But he knew these mountains, knew how quickly they could turn deadly. Whatever Sage thought of him, whatever her reasons for running, he couldn't let her face this wilderness alone. He had to find her, had to make things right. The mule plodded steadily onward, its head low against the growing storm. Above them, the clear blue of dawn had vanished behind heavy clouds that promised more snow to come. Ephraim searched the white landscape with increasing urgency, knowing that every minute counted now. The temperature was dropping. He could feel it in the way the air bit at his exposed skin. Her tracks were almost gone now, just shallow depressions in the deepening snow. But they told a story to his experienced eyes, how she'd started out moving quickly, almost running, then slowed as fatigue and the difficulty of the terrain took their toll. The last clear footprint he could make out showed a stumbling gait, as if she'd been too tired to lift her feet properly. "Hold on," he murmured, though she was far beyond hearing. "Just hold on, I'm coming." The snow continued to fall, erasing all trace of Sage's passage, leaving Ephraim to guide his mule through an increasingly featureless landscape. But he pressed on, driven by guilt and concern in equal measure, knowing that somewhere ahead, a young woman's life, and perhaps more than one life, depended on his ability to find her before the mountain's winter fury claimed another victim. The afternoon sun struggled to pierce the heavy clouds, casting a dim, gray light over Ephraim's empty cabin. Snow had begun falling again, gentle but steady, when the sound of approaching horses broke the mountain stillness. 5 riders emerged from the tree line, their mounts picking their way carefully through the fresh powder. At their head rode a tall man in a black coat, his clerical collar stark white against the dark fabric. Behind him, a deputy's badge glinted dully on a weather-worn vest. The other 3 men were rougher sorts. 2 looked like typical mountain drifters, while the last had the weary, desperate look of a man who'd been riding too long with too little rest. They reined up before the cabin, studying the thin wisp of smoke still rising from the chimney. The preacher dismounted first, his boots crunching in the snow as he strode to the door. He rapped sharply 3 times, then stepped back to wait. When no answer came, the deputy swung down from his saddle. "Looks like nobody's home, Reverend Brackett," he said, touching the rim of his hat. His eyes swept the clearing, noting the fresh tracks leading away from the lean-to. "Someone's been here, though. And recently." The weary rider dismounted as well, moving to stand beside the preacher. "That's my sister's work," he said, pointing to marks in the snow that showed where someone had gathered wood for the stove. "She always stacks. Things just so neat-like, even when she's in a hurry." "Are you certain, Mr. Harland?" The preacher's voice was smooth as creek ice. "We wouldn't want to trouble an innocent settler unnecessarily." "I know my own sister's ways," Harland insisted, though something flickered in his eyes that might have been doubt or guilt. The deputy moved to examine the door. "No lock," he observed. "Common enough up here. Folks tend to trust each other in the high country." He pushed it open, revealing the cabin's sparse interior. The preacher entered first, his tall frame filling the doorway. His sharp gaze took in every detail: the still warm stove, the rumpled bed, the tin cup on the table. "Someone's been here very recently," he said. "Deputy Marin, what do you make of these tracks leading away?" Deputy Wade Marin stepped back outside to study the snow. "2 sets," he reported. "One's from Boots, big ones, likely the cabin's owner. The other," he hesitated, "smaller. Could be a woman's." "My sister," Harland said again, but his voice held less conviction now. The 2 drifters remained mounted, watching the tree line with the wary attention of men accustomed to trouble. One of them spat into the snow. "Ain't natural," he muttered, "a woman traveling alone in these parts." "Miss Harland is not traveling by choice," the preacher said smoothly. "She has obligations to meet, debts that must be paid. As her spiritual advisor, I cannot allow her to abandon her responsibilities." Deputy Marin's hand rested casually on his gun belt. "And as an officer of the law, I'm obliged to assist in recovering property obtained under false pretenses." He glanced at the preacher. "That's how you said it happened, right, Reverend?" Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A lone rider appeared through the falling snow. Ephraim, returning from his unsuccessful search of the lower canyon. He pulled up short at the sight of the strangers clustered around his cabin. For a long moment, nobody moved. Ephraim's hand stayed well clear of his rifle, but his eyes missed nothing as he studied each face in turn. The deputy's badge, the preacher's collar, the desperate cast to Harland's features, the way the 2 drifters had subtly shifted their horses to flank him. "Afternoon," Ephraim said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "Something I can help you gentlemen with?" The preacher stepped forward, spreading his hands in a gesture of peaceful intent. "My name is Reverend Brackett. We're searching for a young woman, one Sage Harland. Her brother here," he gestured to the weary rider, "is most concerned for her welfare." Ephraim's face remained impassive, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "That so?" "Yes," the deputy cut in. "Miss Harland left some rather pressing business unfinished back in town. Signed contracts, you understand? Legal matters." "She's my sister," Harland burst out. "She doesn't understand what she's doing. The indenture was fair. 3 years' service to pay off our father's debts. The Reverend here was kind enough to arrange it all proper and legal." Ephraim sat very still on his mule, letting the snow gather on his shoulders. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Don't get many visitors up here. Can't say as I've seen any woman passing through." The preacher's eyes narrowed slightly. "Indeed. Then perhaps you wouldn't mind explaining the smaller tracks leading away from your cabin? Or the fact that your bed appears recently used by more than one person?" A dangerous silence fell. The two drifters shifted in their saddles, hands drifting closer to their weapons. Deputy Marin watched Ephraim with the calculated attention of a man weighing odds. "Been tracking a wounded deer," Ephraim said finally. "Small one, followed it down into the canyon, but lost the trail in the fresh snow." He nodded toward his bed. "As for that, I move around when I sleep. Always have." "A deer," the preacher repeated softly. "How convenient. And I suppose a deer also left those distinctive marks by your woodpile? The ones Mr. Harland here recognized as his sister's particular way of stacking kindling?" Ephraim shrugged. "Man gets particular about his wood when he lives alone in the mountains. Everything has its proper place." Deputy Marin stepped forward, his boot heels crunching in the snow. "Look here, friend. We're not aiming to cause trouble. Just tell us which way she went, and we'll be on our way. She's got obligations to meet, that's all. Legal ones." "Can't help you," Ephraim said. "Like I said, haven't seen any woman." The preacher studied him for a long moment, then smiled thinly. "Well then, I suppose we'll have to make camp nearby and wait for her to return. Surely a woman alone in these mountains will seek shelter eventually, especially with more snow coming." One of the drifters spat again. "Might save everyone some trouble if you just told us where she went, mister. Woman like that, running from honest debts, ain't worth protecting." Ephraim's expression didn't change, but something cold and hard crept into his eyes. "Sun's getting low," he said. "Storm's building. Canyon's no place for camping tonight. Town's only 4 hours' ride south. If you push hard, you might make it before full dark." "We'll risk it," the preacher said smoothly. "Deputy Marin here knows these mountains well enough. We'll make camp in that sheltered grove just beyond the tree line. Close enough to watch the cabin, far enough to give you your privacy." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Unless, of course, you'd care to be more forthcoming about Miss Harland's whereabouts." Ephraim remained silent, his face unreadable. "Very well." The preacher turned to his companions. "Gentlemen, let's make camp before we lose the light completely. Mr. Harland, you'll stay with us, of course. We wouldn't want your sister to miss seeing her beloved brother should she return." Harland nodded jerkily, though something like shame crossed his features as he avoided Ephraim's steady gaze. The group moved off toward the grove, leaving Ephraim alone before his cabin. He waited until they were out of sight before dismounting, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the tension thrumming through his body. Inside, he moved around the cabin as he would on any normal evening, banking the fire, setting water to heat, preparing his simple supper. But his mind raced. The hymn page crinkled in his shirt pocket as he moved, reminding him of the young woman who was somewhere out in the growing storm. Whatever trouble she was in, one thing was clear. These men meant her no good, whatever they claimed about legal obligations and brotherly concern. Through the cabin's small window, he could see the glow of their campfire through the trees. They meant to wait him out, watching to see if Sage returned. But they didn't know these mountains like he did. Didn't know all the ways a person could come and go unseen if they knew the secret paths. As darkness fell, snow continued to drift down from the heavy sky. Ephraim moved about his evening routine, all the while listening for any sound that might signal Sage's return, hoping she had found shelter somewhere safe, yet dreading the possibility that she might walk into the trap these men had laid. The campfire in the grove burned steady through the early evening hours. Occasionally voices carried on the wind, the preacher's smooth tones, the deputy's shorter replies, the drifter's coarser speech. Of Harland, there was no sound at all. Ephraim sat in his cabin, watching the snow fall and considering his options. The hymn page weighed like lead in his pocket, its words of belief and redemption a silent accusation. He had failed to protect Sage once already, letting her flee into danger. Now these men had come, bringing with them a tangle of claims and obligations he didn't fully understand. But he understood enough. Understood the look in the preacher's eyes, the way the deputy's hand never strayed far from his gun, the shame in Harlan's face when he spoke of the indenture. Understood that whatever legal papers they might wave, what they intended for Sage was nothing good. Night settled fully over the mountains, and still the campfire burned in the grove. They were patient men, these hunters. They could afford to wait. But so could Ephraim. He had not survived years alone in these mountains by being rash or careless. He would watch and wait, and when the moment came, as it surely would, he would be ready. For now, though, he could only pray that wherever Sage was, she had found shelter from the storm, and that she would have the wisdom to stay far from the trap that waited at his cabin door. The first pale light of dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-laden branches in shades of pearl and silver. Ephraim's mule picked its way carefully through the deep drifts, steam puffing from its nostrils in the crisp morning air. They had searched the canyon through the night, finding nothing but old deer tracks and the occasional rabbit trail. His joints ached from the cold, and weariness dragged at his shoulders. But something else weighed heavier. The knowledge that Sage was out there somewhere, alone and possibly hurt. The memory of her face, frightened and ashamed as she'd fled his cabin, haunted him with each step. As they rounded the final bend toward his cabin, Ephraim pulled the mule up short. Through the trees, he caught glimpses of horses, 5 of them, stamping and snorting in the early morning chill. The men's camp was still there, thin wisps of smoke rising from their banked fire. Instead of approaching directly, Ephraim dismounted and led his mule into a dense stand of pine trees, well away from the cabin. He secured the animal with practiced movements, his fingers working quickly despite the cold. Then, moving as silently as his years of hunting had taught him, he crept closer to the camp. The men's voices carried clearly in the still morning air. Ephraim settled behind a thick trunk, close enough to hear but hidden from view. Snow crunched as someone paced near the dying fire. "Wasting time here," one of the drifters growled. "Girl's probably frozen to death by now." "She ain't dead." That was the man claiming to be her brother, his voice tight with strain. "Sage knows these mountains better than you think. She used to." "Quiet." The preacher's smooth voice cut through the conversation. "Mr. Harland, your concern for your sister is admirable, but let's not forget our arrangement. The mining deed must be recovered intact." Ephraim's eyes narrowed. Mining deed? That was the first he'd heard of any such thing. "I don't care about no deed," Harland burst out. "That's your business with her. I just want—" "You want your share," the deputy interrupted coldly. "Same as the rest of us, so mind your tongue about family feelings." Silence fell for a moment, broken only by the snap of burning wood as someone stirred the fire. When the preacher spoke again, his voice had an edge of steel beneath its usual smoothness. "The girl must be taken alive. The deed is worthless without her signature, and she's clever enough to have hidden it where we won't find it without her cooperation. Remember that before any of you get over-eager." "Ain't natural," the second drifter muttered. "Woman running wild in the mountains causing all this trouble. Should have handled her back in town when we had the chance." "And risk the deed being lost forever?" The preacher's voice dripped with contempt. "No, we do this carefully. The indenture papers give us legal right to take her, and once she's secured, we'll have time to persuade her regarding the deed's location." Something in his tone made Ephraim's hand tighten on his rifle. He'd heard men speak that way before, during the war. Nothing good ever followed. "Still say, this trapper knows more than he's telling," the deputy said. "Way he acted yesterday. Man's hiding something." "Indeed." Boot steps crunched in the snow as the preacher moved. Which is why you and Jenkins will stay here to watch the cabin. The rest of us will sweep the likely trails. She has to be somewhere close." Ephraim had heard enough. Moving carefully, he began working his way back through the trees. His mind raced, fitting together the pieces of what he'd learned. The story about debts and indenture was clearly false, or at least not the whole truth. These men wanted something from Sage, something valuable enough to drive them into the mountains after her. And whatever it was, they meant to take it by force if necessary. He reached his mule and quickly checked the saddlebags. He had enough supplies for several days, but he'd need more if he was going to track Sage south toward the timberline. That meant getting back into his cabin, right under the noses of the men watching it. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. From his hidden position, Ephraim watched as 3 of the men, the preacher, Harland, and one of the drifters, rode out to search the surrounding area. The deputy and the remaining drifter took up positions where they could watch both the cabin and the main approaches to it. As dusk approached, Ephraim began moving closer to the cabin, using every scrap of cover the terrain provided. The deputy had built a small fire near the front of the cabin, while the drifter patrolled the back. Their confidence in their position made them careless. They clearly didn't expect anyone to attempt approaching in the growing darkness. The sun set, painting the snow-covered peaks in deep purple and gold. In the gathering gloom, Ephraim worked his way around to the back of the cabin. He knew every loose board, every creaking floorboard in the structure he'd built with his own hands. More importantly, he knew about the small trap door he'd installed under the cabin's floor, intended for storing extra supplies during the worst winter months. He waited until the drifter's patrol took him around the far corner, then slipped beneath the cabin. The space was tight, and ice-cold snow pressed against his chest as he worked the trap door open with fingers nearly numb from cold. Above him, boots thudded across the cabin floor, the deputy checking inside again. Ephraim held perfectly still, barely breathing, until the boots retreated. Then he eased himself up through the trap door and into the cabin's familiar darkness. Moving purely by touch and memory, he gathered what he needed: extra ammunition, dried meat, a heavier coat, his best compass. Each item went into a canvas bag, wrapped in cloth to prevent any telltale noise. He was almost finished when a board creaked outside the door. Ephraim froze, one hand on his rifle. The door handle turned slowly. In 2 silent steps, he was behind the door as it swung open. The deputy's shadow fell, across the floor, pistol drawn. "Thought I heard something," the man muttered, stepping inside. Ephraim pressed himself flat against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. The deputy moved further into the cabin, checking the corners with professional thoroughness. But he never thought to look behind the door. After what felt like an eternity, the deputy backed out, closing the door behind him. "Nothing," Ephraim heard him call to his partner. "Just the wind, probably." Ephraim waited another 10 minutes before slipping back through the trap door, his bag of supplies secured across his back. Getting clear of the cabin took another hour of careful movement, but finally he made it back to where he'd left his mule. The storm had blown itself out during the day, leaving the sky clear and cold. The waning moon cast enough light to travel by, throwing sharp shadows across the snow. Ephraim led his mule well away from the cabin before mounting up and turning south. He had no way of knowing for certain that Sage had gone this direction, but it made sense. South led toward the timberline, toward settlements and people. North held nothing but higher mountains and deeper wilderness. A woman running scared would head for civilization, especially if she carried something valuable enough to make men chase her through winter mountains. The moon rode high overhead, as Ephraim guided his mule along game trails and narrow paths that only locals knew. His thoughts kept returning to what he'd overheard. A mining deed valuable enough to drive 5 men to kidnapping. A brother who seemed caught between family loyalty and greed. A preacher whose smooth words couldn't quite hide the threat of violence. And somewhere ahead of him, a young woman carrying a burden he didn't fully understand. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had to find her before they did. Whatever her story was, whatever trouble she was in, she deserved better than being hunted down like an animal. The mule's hooves made soft, crunching sounds in the snow as they worked their way south. Ephraim's eyes constantly scanned the ground for any sign of recent passage, any trace that might tell him which way Sage had gone. The night was bitterly cold, but clear and still. Good tracking weather, if you knew what to look for. He touched the hymn page in his pocket, its paper soft and worn. Whosoever shall believe. The words seemed to mock him now. He'd stopped believing in much of anything during the war. But maybe, he thought, this wasn't about belief. Maybe it was simply about doing what was right, about not standing by while evil men pursued their prey. The moon began its slow descent toward the western peaks as Ephraim pressed on. Somewhere ahead lay the timberline, and beyond that, the settlements of the lower valleys. But between here and there was a lot of dangerous country where a desperate woman might hide, or where desperate men might corner their quarry. He had to find her. First, had to reach her before they did. The alternative didn't bear thinking about. The winter sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered valley as Ephraim guided his mule along a narrow game trail. 2 days of careful tracking had led him steadily southward, following faint signs that most men would have missed. A broken twig here, a scuffed patch of snow there, the barest hints of someone passing in desperate haste. The creek ahead marked the boundary between the high country and the gentler slopes that led down toward civilization. Ephraim reined in his mule, scanning the area with practiced eyes. Something dark marred the pristine white of the snow near the water's edge, half hidden behind a fallen log. His heart jumped when he realized it was a body. "Whoa there," he murmured to his mule, dismounting quickly. The snow crunched under his boots as he approached, rifle ready. But there was no movement, no sign of threat. Only the still form of a woman lying beside the frozen creek, her skirts stiff with frost. "Miss Harland?" He kept his voice low, though they were likely miles from her pursuers. When she didn't respond, he knelt beside her. Sage's face was pale, her lips tinged with blue, but a faint warmth still clung to her neck when he checked for a pulse, and shallow breaths stirred in her chest. She was alive, but wouldn't be for long in this cold. Ephraim worked quickly, gathering dead branches from beneath the snow and starting a small fire in the lee of a large boulder. The flames caught slowly, but soon a steady warmth began to push back the bitter cold. He laid out his bedroll near the fire, then carefully lifted Sage and placed her on it, wrapping her in his spare blankets. "Easy now," he murmured when she stirred slightly. "You're safe." The sun had moved noticeably across the sky by the time color began returning to her cheeks. Ephraim kept the fire burning steady, melting snow in his tin cup to make hot water. He'd just finished adding the last of his coffee when Sage's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she stared at him in confusion. Then memory flooded back, and she tried to scramble away, terror plain on her face. "Peace," Ephraim said softly, keeping his hands where she could see them. "I ain't here to hurt you, Miss Harland, just to help." You're the man from the cabin." Her voice was rough from cold and exhaustion. "Why did you follow me?" "Because them others following you don't mean you well." He offered her the cup of coffee. "And I reckon anyone running that hard from a preacher has good reason." Sage's hands shook as she took the cup, but she managed a small sip. "You've seen them? The men looking for me?" Ephraim nodded. 5 of them. One claiming to be your brother, though I got doubts about that. He added another stick to the fire. "They're watching my cabin, waiting for you to come back. But they won't find us here." "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the warm cup like a lifeline. "For helping me. But you don't understand. You can't get mixed up in this. The preacher, he's—" She broke off, shuddering. "Tell me," Ephraim said gently. "Whatever trouble you're in, it can't be worse than freezing to death out here." Sage was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My father borrowed money from the preacher's revival camp, said it was for a mining venture that would make us rich." Her bitter laugh held no humor. "Instead, he drank himself to death, leaving me with the debt. The preacher said he'd forget it if I sang for his revival meetings." She took another sip of coffee. "But then he started talking about selling my contract to the mining company, said they needed women to cook and clean for the workers." "Indenture," Ephraim growled. "Slavery by another name." Sage nodded. "I heard him negotiating with the mine boss. They weren't talking about cooking." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "So I ran, took what little money we had left and fled north. I thought if I could just get far enough away." "You did right," Ephraim said firmly. "Ain't no debt worth what they had planned." He stood, checking the position of the sun. "But we can't stay here. They'll be working their way south, same as I did. We need better shelter before dark." Fear flickered across Sage's face. "Where?" "There's an old line shack about 3 miles west of here. Used to belong to the stage company before they changed the route." He began gathering their supplies. "It ain't much, but it's solid enough to keep out the cold, and it's well off the main trails." "Why are you helping me?" Sage asked suddenly. "You don't know me, don't owe me anything." Ephraim paused in his work, considering his words carefully. "Maybe because I've seen too many good folks get ground down by men who twist the Lord's words to serve their own ends. Maybe because everyone deserves a chance at something better." He secured the last of their gear on the mule. "Or maybe just because it's right." Sage studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you," she said softly. "God help me, but I do." "Can you ride?" When she nodded again, he helped her onto the mule's back. "It ain't far, but the trail's rough in places. Hold tight to the saddle horn." They set out westward, Ephraim leading the mule on foot. The afternoon sun cast their shadows long across the snow as they picked their way through the trees. Sage swayed slightly in the saddle, but kept her seat. Neither spoke much. She seemed lost in thought, and Ephraim focused on watching for signs of pursuit. The line shack appeared just as the sun touched the western peaks, a low, sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs, half hidden among a stand of pine trees. Ephraim circled it once, checking for tracks or other signs of recent use, before helping Sage dismount. "It ain't much," he said, pushing open the creaking door. "But it's dry, and the chimney's still good." The interior was simple. A small iron stove, a narrow cot with a straw-filled mattress, a rough table with one chair. But the roof was solid, and the walls kept out the wind. Ephraim soon had a fire going in the stove, while Sage huddled near it, warming her hands. "We can stay here tonight," he said, setting out some of his supplies. "Get you properly warm and rested. Tomorrow we can talk about where you want to go from here." "I don't know," Sage admitted quietly. "I never thought much beyond getting away. I have an aunt in Denver, but—" She trailed off, looking lost. First things first, Ephraim said gently. Rest. Eat something. We'll figure out the rest when you're stronger. He began preparing a simple meal of dried meat and beans. I meant what I said before. I aim to see you safe, wherever that leads. Sage watched him work, her expression a mix of gratitude and lingering wariness. Thank you, she said finally, for everything. I know it's not much, but I have a little money. Keep it, he cut her off firmly. You'll need it wherever you end up. He stirred the beans, adding a pinch of salt. Besides, some things ain't about money. They ate in companionable silence as darkness settled outside. The wind picked up, whistling through the pine trees, but the line shack's walls held firm. Ephraim gave Sage the cot, making his own bed near the stove with his bedroll. Try to rest, he said, banking the fire for the night. We're well off any trail they might follow, but we'll need to move careful tomorrow all the same. Mr. Cade? Sage's voice was soft in the darkness. Why did you really come after me? The truth? Ephraim was quiet for a long moment, considering. Because I saw something in your eyes that morning at my cabin, he said finally. Something that said you were running from more than just shame or embarrassment, and because I've spent too many years watching bad things happen when good people look the other way. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing me, for helping. Get some sleep, Miss Harland. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure out what comes next. The wind continued its lonely song outside as they settled into an uneasy rest. Their truce was fragile, built on desperate circumstances and cautious trust. But it was a beginning. A small flame of hope in the darkness, like the banked coals in the stove that would keep them warm through the night. Ephraim lay awake for a long time, listening to Sage's steady breathing and the whisper of wind in the pines. He knew the men pursuing her wouldn't give up easily, not with whatever stake they had in forcing her return. But he'd made his choice. Whatever came next, he would see her safe. The night deepened around the line shack, and eventually sleep came to them both. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering their tracks and wrapping their shelter in a blanket of white silence. Morning crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Ephraim stood outside the line shack, studying the roof with a critical eye. Patches of rotted wood showed through the weathered shingles, and one corner sagged dangerously under its burden of snow. Needs fixing before the next storm hits, he muttered, more to himself than to Sage, who stood wrapped in his spare coat nearby. Them shingles won't hold much longer? Sage hugged the coat tighter, watching him gather tools from his saddlebags. Is there something I can do to help? Ephraim paused, considering. Pine boughs would make good bedding, better than that old straw in there. He gestured toward a stand of trees. Fresh ones, mind you, still green. They'll be softer, and the scent helps keep vermin away. I know which ones, Sage said, a hint of pride in her voice. Papa used to send me gathering when we couldn't afford proper bedding on the revival circuit. Something flickered across Ephraim's face. Sympathy, perhaps, or understanding. He nodded toward a hatchet leaning against the wall. Take that. Stay within sight of the shack. Any trouble, you holler. Sage took the hatchet, testing its weight in her hand. I will. And thank you for treating me like I'm capable, not just someone to be protected. Their eyes met briefly before Ephraim looked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her gaze. Ain't nothing. Just sense to share the work. He watched her make her way carefully through the snow before climbing up to the roof. The morning was clear and cold, perfect for repairs. As he worked, removing damaged shingles and replacing rotted boards, His thoughts kept drifting to the woman below. Sage moved methodically among the trees, selecting branches with care. The familiar work brought back memories, some bitter, some sweet. She found herself humming an old hymn as she gathered, one her mama had taught her long ago. "That's pretty," Ephraim called down, surprising her. "Sounds familiar somehow." "Amazing Grace," she replied, looking up. "Though I expect you've heard fancier versions than mine." He shook his head, hammering another board into place. "Ain't about fancy. Sometimes the plainest things carry the most truth." The morning passed in companionable silence, broken by the rhythm of Ephraim's hammer and the soft swish of pine boughs being gathered. Around midday, Sage paused in her work, watching him move across the roof with sure-footed grace despite his size. "You've got scars," she observed quietly. "I noticed them. That night. At your cabin." Ephraim's hammer stopped mid-swing. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. "War," he finally said, voice rough. "Scouting for the army. Learned a lot about men during those years. Most of it I wish I could forget." "Is that why you live alone up there?" "Partly." He resumed his work, each blow of the hammer punctuating his words. "Easier sometimes. Being alone. No one to disappoint. No one to hurt you. Or to help you," Sage said softly, but he gave no sign of hearing. As afternoon settled in, Ephraim finished the roof while Sage arranged the pine boughs inside. The small space slowly transformed, becoming more livable. The fresh pine scent filled the air, mixing with wood smoke from the stove. "I should fix us something to eat," Sage offered, eyeing their dwindling supplies. "Least I can do with you working all day." Ephraim nodded, cleaning his tools. "Beans in my pack. Some salt pork, too, if you want to fancy them up a bit." Sage set to work at the small stove, humming again as she cooked. The domestic scene felt strange, yet somehow right, as if they'd found a pocket of peace in the midst of their troubles. But peace, she knew too well, had a way of proving temporary. The beans were just starting to bubble when it happened. Sage reached to adjust the pot, and her hand slipped, grazing the hot iron. Pain shot through her palm, and she gasped, jerking back. Ephraim was beside her in 2 long strides. "Let me see," he said, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. When she hesitated, he added, "Please." Slowly, she extended her hand. The burn wasn't severe, but it had raised an angry red welt across her palm. Ephraim examined it carefully, his own rough hands surprisingly tender. "Wait here," he murmured. From his pack, he retrieved a small tin of salve. "Old Ute medicine," he explained, opening it. "Works better than anything I ever got from army doctors." The salve was cool against her skin, bringing immediate relief. Sage watched as he worked it carefully into the burn, his big hands impossibly gentle. "You've done this before," she observed, "had practice." His focus remained on her hand, but something in his voice had softened. "Treating burns, wounds, during the war, after. Learned that healing's just as important as fighting, maybe more so." Their eyes met, and for a moment something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a shared wound that went deeper than flesh. Then a sound split the evening air, making them both freeze. A gunshot. Distant, but clear in the still mountain air. Ephraim's grip on her hand tightened fractionally before he let go. In 2 quick steps, he was at the window, peering out through a gap in the shutters. "No more than a mile away," he whispered. "South Ridge, I reckon." Sage felt her heart begin to race. "Them?" He nodded grimly. "Hunting party that size, this time of year? Has to be." Moving with careful silence, he extinguished the lantern, leaving only the dim glow from the banked stove. "Stay away from the windows. Keep low." Sage pressed herself against the wall beside him, hardly daring to breathe. In the sudden darkness, every sound seemed magnified. The pop of cooling wood in the stove, the whisper of wind through the pine boughs, their own beating hearts. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Ephraim's hand found hers in the darkness, squeeze reassuring. "They're still moving south," he whispered. "Probably spotted deer sign. We're all right for now." But they both knew "for now" was a fragile thing. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited, listening. Sage found herself counting heartbeats, trying to still their frantic rhythm. Ephraim's presence beside her was solid, grounding, and she realized she'd moved closer to him without conscious thought. The silence grew deeper as darkness settled outside. No more shots disturbed the evening, but the tension remained. They stayed there, barely breathing, as the last light faded from the gaps in the shutters. Finally, Ephraim spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Need to keep the fire low tonight. No light showing, but it's going to get cold." "I'm not afraid of cold," Sage whispered back. "Not anymore." She felt, rather than saw him turn to look at her. "No," he said softly. "Reckon you're not afraid of much anymore." "That's not true," she admitted. "I'm afraid of plenty. Just learning to live with it, I suppose." His hand found hers again in the darkness, and this time neither pulled away. They stood together, listening to the night, their shared warmth a small defiance against the cold and fear pressing in from outside. The beans were forgotten, slowly cooling on the stove, but neither moved to save them. Some moments demanded stillness, demanded witness. This was one of them, this quiet understanding building between them, as fragile and precious as a wild thing newly tamed. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and steady, covering the tracks that might have betrayed them. Inside, two people who had learned to trust only themselves began the slower, harder work of learning to trust each other. They waited together in the darkness, hearts beating in time, while the night deepened around their small shelter. Whatever came next would come soon enough. For now, this moment was enough. This shared silence, this tentative trust, this understanding that grew stronger with each passing breath. The pine boughs released their sweet scent into the darkness, mingling with wood smoke and the lingering smell of burned beans. Outside, the wind whispered secrets to the trees, and somewhere in the distance, their pursuers made camp for the night. But here, in this small space they'd carved out of wilderness and fear, something new was taking root, something neither had expected to find in their flight from darker things. Trust, like hope, could grow in the most unlikely places. Sometimes it needed only the smallest spark, a gentle touch, a moment of shared danger, a whispered understanding in the dark. Tonight, that spark had caught, and though neither spoke of it, both felt its warmth. Morning light filtered through the pine branches as Ephraim led Sage to a small clearing. His old Colt single-action revolver weighed heavy in his hands as he considered how to begin. "First rule," he said, holding the weapon with practiced care. "Always treat it like it's loaded, even when you know it ain't." Sage nodded, her eyes fixed on the gun. Her hands were red from the morning cold, but she didn't complain. She hadn't complained about anything since they'd started these lessons 3 days ago. "Show me how you hold it again," Ephraim said, passing her the Colt. Her fingers wrapped around the grip awkwardly, like she was holding a snake that might bite. Ephraim stepped closer, adjusting her stance. "Keep your arms straight but not locked," he instructed. "Both eyes open." The target was a tin can perched on a stump 20 paces away. Sage squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, causing a flock of sparrows to burst from a nearby tree. "Better," Ephraim said. "You didn't flinch that time." "Still missed," she muttered, but determination hardened her jaw. "Took me months to hit anything smaller than a barn when I first started," he admitted. "You're doing fine." They practiced until the morning sun climbed higher, marking time for other lessons. Ephraim had been teaching her survival skills bit by bit, things she'd need if they got separated, though he didn't say that part aloud. "Now for something that'll feed you better than bullets," he said, leading her to where he'd set snares the previous evening. "Rabbit signs everywhere in this meadow." Sage followed him through the melting snow, her steps becoming surer each day. The first trap was empty, but the second held a snowshoe hare, its white winter coat beginning to mottle with brown patches. "Your turn to set it again," Ephraim said, showing her how to reset the snare after retrieving their catch. Sage's fingers fumbled with the wire, but she kept at it until the trap was properly placed. "Like that?" she asked. "Just right." He watched her face light up at the praise. "You're a quick study." "Had to be, learning all those hymns on the revival circuit," she said, then grew quiet as memories darkened her expression. Ephraim busied himself with the rabbit, giving her space. He'd learned that sometimes silence said more than words ever could. That evening, they sat by a small fire he'd taught her to build. The rabbit stew simmered in his trail pot while Sage practiced striking matches with hands that shook less each time. Whole verse goes, "Be strong and of good courage. Fear not, nor be afraid of them," she said suddenly, breaking their comfortable silence. "For the Lord thy God, he it is that doth go with thee. He will not fail thee, nor forsake thee." Ephraim stirred the stew, considering her words. "Deuteronomy," he said finally. "Been a while since I heard that one." "You know scripture?" Surprise colored her voice. "Used to, before the war." He tested the meat with his knife. "Haven't done much praying since then." "Why not?" He kept his eyes on the pot. "Saw things. Did things. Makes a man wonder if anyone's listening up there." "Maybe that's when we need to pray the most," she said softly. "When we're lost." The fire crackled between them, sending sparks up toward the darkening sky. Ephraim didn't respond, but her words settled in him like seeds in spring soil. Days passed in this rhythm of lessons and quiet conversations. Sage's aim improved enough to clip the edge of a can at 15 paces. Her fires caught quicker, her snares held stronger. With each small victory, her shoulders straightened a little more, her chin lifted higher. One morning, as winter's grip loosened its hold on the mountain, Ephraim showed her how to read tracks in the muddy earth. "See here?" He pointed to a clear print. Elk passed through before dawn, heading toward water. Sage knelt beside him, her skirts gathered carefully above the mud. "How can you tell when?" "Edges are still sharp. Any older, and they'd be worn down by the morning dew." She studied the tracks intently, then pointed to another set. "What made these?" "Coyote. Probably following the elk, hoping for a young one or a weak one." He glanced at her. "Nature ain't always kind, but it's honest about it." "Unlike people," she said quietly. They moved on, Ephraim teaching her to spot the signs most eyes would miss: broken twigs, pressed grass, bark rubbed smooth by passing deer. Sage absorbed it all, her face serious with concentration. That afternoon, working together, they caught 3 rabbits in their snares. Sage cleaned them herself, her hands steady despite the task. "Never thought I'd be doing this," she said, but there was pride in her voice. "Life has a way of teaching us what we need to know," Ephraim replied, "whether we want to learn it or not." The days grew longer, snow retreating up the mountainsides. Sage's movements became more confident. Her laughter came easier. One morning, as she successfully built a fire from damp wood, her face broke into a full smile, the first Ephraim had seen since that stormy night at his cabin. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Something in his chest tightened, then loosened, like a knot finally giving way. He turned quickly to check their back trail, hiding whatever showed on his face. But their borrowed peace couldn't last forever. That afternoon, Ephraim spotted it, a thin line of smoke rising from a ridge to the north. Too steady for a campfire, too controlled for a wildfire. His jaw tightened as he counted the days in his head. "Sage," he called softly, motioning her over. "Look there." She followed his pointing finger, her smile fading as she saw the smoke. "Them?" "Most likely. They're working a search pattern, closing in." He studied her face. "You remember everything we practiced?" She nodded, fingers brushing the colt now riding at her hip. "I remember." "Good." He began mentally cataloging their options, paths of escape, defensible positions. "We'll break camp at first light, travel fast." That night, neither slept much. They sat close by their small fire, speaking in low voices about things that mattered: faith and fear, guilt and hope. Sage recited psalms from memory, her voice steady in the darkness. Ephraim listened, and if his own lips moved silently along with certain verses, neither of them mentioned it. The fire burned low, casting their shadows long against the cabin walls. Outside, spring crept slowly up the mountainside, bringing with it both promise and peril. But in that moment, watching Sage's face in the firelight as she spoke words of ancient comfort, Ephraim felt something he hadn't known in years, a flickering, fragile hope, as tender as new grass pushing through melting snow. Come morning, they would run again. But tonight, they had this: shared warmth, shared purpose, and the growing strength of two souls learning to trust again. The smoke on the horizon promised trouble, but they would face it together, changed by these days of patient teaching and quiet growth. Sage's voice rose softly in another hymn, one about deliverance and dawn. Ephraim cleaned his gun and watched the fire die to embers, while overhead, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas playing out beneath their light. The afternoon sun filtered through the pine boughs, casting dappled shadows across the line shack's weathered boards. Inside, Ephraim mended a torn leather strap, while Sage stirred a pot of wild greens and dried beef. The familiar domestic rhythm they'd developed over the past days felt almost peaceful, despite the constant threat hanging over them. Sage wiped her hands on her skirts and moved to the cabin's single window, staring out at nothing. Her shoulders trembled slightly. "Stew's likely done," Ephraim said quietly, not looking up from his work. She didn't respond. When he glanced up, he saw tears tracking down her cheeks. "Sage?" He set aside the leather, concern etching his features. "I can't..." Her voice broke. "I can't keep pretending anymore. There's more you need to know." She pressed her fingers to her lips, trying to hold back sobs. Ephraim stood slowly, careful not to startle her. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." She turned to face him, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "It's not just about me. There's a child, my sister's boy." The revelation hung in the air between them. Ephraim remained silent, giving her space to continue. "His name is Timothy. He's only 4 years old." Sage's words tumbled out faster now, like a dam breaking. "My sister Hannah died bringing him into this world. His father was a mining prospector who'd struck a rich claim, but he disappeared before Timothy was born, left behind a deed that would have secured the boy's future. Understanding began to dawn in Ephraim's mind. The men following us, they're after the deed? Sage nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. The preacher found out somehow, started pressing Hannah about it before she died. Then he turned on me, saying our father's debts gave him claim over both of us, and Timothy too. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I couldn't let them take him. Where is he now? Ephraim's voice was gentle but urgent. With friends, a Ute family that Hannah helped once, their youngest had mountain fever, and she nursed him through it. They've been hiding Timothy since I ran. She twisted her hands together. They live in a protected valley, about 2 days' ride from here. The Running Deer Band. Ephraim's expression shifted. I know them. Traded with their chief last winter. You do? Hope flickered across Sage's tear-stained face. Good people. They'll have kept him safe. He moved closer, speaking softly. But if those men figure out where he is, they'll hurt anyone who stands in their way. Sage's voice shook with fear and anger. The deed's worth thousands, enough to drive greedy men to terrible things. Ephraim ran a hand over his beard, thinking hard. The smoke we saw yesterday, they're getting closer. We need to move fast. I should have told you sooner. Shame colored her words. I was afraid. Afraid you might think like them? He shook his head. No need to explain. Trust takes time out here. Sage wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. Timothy's all I have left of Hannah. I promised her I'd protect him, give him the life she wanted for him. But I'm so scared, Ephraim. What if we're too late? The raw fear in her voice stirred something deep in Ephraim's chest. He'd seen too much darkness in men's hearts during the war, but he'd also witnessed courage in the most unlikely places. Looking at Sage now, this woman who'd risked everything to save her sister's child, he recognized that same fierce courage. We'll leave tonight, he said firmly. Less chance of being spotted in the dark. I know these mountains better than those men ever will, and I know a hidden trail to the Ute Valley. Relief and gratitude washed over Sage's features. You'll help us? Ain't no child deserves to be hunted for money. His voice hardened, and no decent man would use a preacher's collar to hide such wickedness. They spent the remaining daylight preparing. Ephraim checked his rifle and ammunition, while teaching Sage to load the Colt properly. She packed what little food they had, along with the medical supplies he'd insisted on carrying. Every sound from outside made them freeze, but no riders appeared. As Sage rolled their blankets, she spoke softly. Hannah used to sing him to sleep with hymns, said our mama did the same for us. She paused, lost in memory. The night before she died, she made me promise to keep singing to him, to remember that love is stronger than fear. Ephraim secured the last of their supplies onto his mule. Your sister sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Sage touched the small cross hanging at her throat. Sometimes I hear her voice in my head, telling me to be brave. But it's hard, being brave all alone. You ain't alone anymore, Ephraim said quietly. Their eyes met in the dimming light. Something unspoken passed between them. A recognition of shared purpose, of trust earned through days of patient teaching and quiet understanding. As darkness settled over the mountains, they doused their fire and erased all signs of their presence. Ephraim led them out under a clouded moon, following game trails and hidden paths that wound through the wilderness. Sage rode close behind him, one hand resting near the colt at her hip, no longer the frightened woman who'd appeared at his door in a storm. They traveled in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Ephraim's mind worked through their options, mapping routes and calculating risks. He knew the territory well enough to avoid the main trails, but moving at night brought its own dangers. Every shadow could hide a mountain lion. Every snapping twig could signal an ambush. Near midnight, they paused to rest the horses in a sheltered hollow. Sage pulled her shawl tighter against the spring night's chill. "Tell me about Timothy," Ephraim said softly, offering her his canteen. A smile touched her lips for the first time since her revelation. "He has Hannah's eyes. Bright blue, like summer sky. Curious about everything. Loves stories about animals and mountains." She handed back the canteen. "The Ute children taught him their games. He probably speaks their language better than English now." "Children adapt quick," Ephraim nodded. "Saw that often during my scouting days. Different tongues, different ways, but they find common ground in play." "Do you think—" Sage hesitated. "Do you think he'll remember me? It's been months since I left him there." "A child remembers love," Ephraim assured her, "and it sounds like you gave him plenty to remember." They rested for another hour, then mounted up again. The moon occasionally broke through the clouds, casting enough light to navigate by. Ephraim led them higher into the mountains, following a trail that would take them around the likely camp of their pursuers. As they rode, Sage spoke quietly about Hannah. Her fierce spirit, her healing skills learned from their mother, her dreams for her son. The stories seemed to give her strength, each memory a thread weaving together her resolve. "She wasn't afraid to love people others shunned," Sage said. "That's how she met Timothy's father. He was sick, half dead from fever when he staggered into our camp. Hannah nursed him back to health." She adjusted her grip on the reins. "They fell in love during his recovery. He promised to return with enough money to give her a proper life. Said he had a claim that would make them rich." "But he never came back," Ephraim finished softly. "No. We waited months. Hannah held on, believing he'd return, even as her time grew near." Sage's voice caught. Her last words were about Timothy, making me swear to keep him safe, to make sure he knew he was loved. They rode in silence for a while, the horses' hooves making soft sounds against the rocky ground. Finally, Ephraim spoke. "My brother died in the war," he said, the words coming slowly. "Made him a promise too, to live enough for both of us. Took me years to understand what that meant." He glanced back at Sage. "Sometimes keeping a promise means more than just surviving. Means finding something worth living for." Sage met his gaze, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Like protecting a child who needs us?" "Like that," he nodded. "And maybe like helping someone else keep their promise too." The night deepened around them as they pushed on, drawing closer to their destination with each careful step. Both knew that dawn would bring new challenges, pursuing riders, treacherous terrain, and the desperate race to reach Timothy before the hunters did. But something had shifted between them. Sage's secret, now shared, had forged a stronger bond than mere survival. They rode together not just as fugitives, but as protectors of an innocent child's future, a purpose that gave their flight new meaning. Above them, stars wheeled in their eternal dance, watching over two souls united by trust, compassion, and the fierce determination to keep a sister's final promise. Dawn painted the sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as Ephraim and Sage guided their mounts through the thawing forest. Spring's awakening touched everything around them. Melting snow dripped from pine boughs, and patches of muddy earth showed through the winter's white blanket. Their horses' hooves made soft, sucking sounds in the wet ground as they followed a narrow trail that wound between towering spruce trees. Sage rode closer to Ephraim, her voice barely above a whisper. How much further? Should reach the camp by sunset. He studied the terrain ahead. Tawa's people stay hidden in these valleys during the spring hunt. Most white folks don't know the paths. The mention of Tawa brought a flicker of hope to Sage's tired features. You trust him? With my life, Ephraim answered without hesitation. We fought together in the war, saved each other more times than I can count. He adjusted his rifle across his saddle. He's a man of honor. If he gave his word to protect your boy, he kept it. They rode in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher. The forest grew denser, the trail harder to follow. Ephraim led them through shortcuts he remembered from his scouting days, around boulder fields, across shallow streams where ice still clung to the banks. Every so often he would halt them, listening intently for any sign of pursuit. Near midday, they stopped to rest the horses in a small clearing. Sage stretched her tired muscles while Ephraim checked their back trail. The warmth of the spring sun had loosened her tension somewhat, but anxiety still lined her face. Tell me about Tawa, she said as they shared dried venison and hard biscuits. How did you come to trust each other? Ephraim chewed thoughtfully before answering. It was during the worst of the fighting. My unit got caught in an ambush. Bad situation. Tawa's group had every right to finish us. Off. He paused, remembering. Instead, he recognized that the violence served no one, helped broker a peace talk that saved lives on both sides. And you've been friends since? More like brothers who walk different paths. Ephraim gathered their supplies. He taught me to see beyond what I thought I knew about his people, showed me there's always another way besides fighting. They mounted up again, pushing on through the afternoon. The trail climbed steadily, winding through stands of aspen where tiny buds hinted at coming leaves. Sage hummed hymns under her breath, songs that spoke of hope and deliverance. The familiar melodies seemed to calm her nerves. As the sun began its westward descent, Ephraim spotted the first sign, a broken branch placed just so, marking a turn only those who knew would recognize. He guided them off the main trail, following markers that grew more frequent. A stack of 3 stones, a strip of bark peeled in a particular way. We're close, he murmured. Remember, let me speak first. Show respect, but don't bow or act fearful. Tawa's people value honest strength. Sage nodded, squaring her shoulders. The last hour of riding brought them through a narrow canyon where shadows grew long and deep. When they emerged, the Ute camp spread before them in a protected valley, a scatter of hide-covered lodges, cooking fires sending thin streams of smoke into the evening air. 2 mounted warriors appeared silently from the trees, weapons ready but not threatening. Ephraim raised his empty hand in greeting, speaking a few words in their language. After a tense moment, one rider nodded and wheeled his horse toward camp. They waited at the valley's edge until a tall figure emerged from the largest lodge. Even at a distance, Ephraim recognized Tawa's distinctive stride. The Ute scout approached them slowly, his face unreadable in the fading light. Brother, Ephraim said quietly, dismounting, it has been many moons. Tawa studied them both before speaking. The snow melts, and you return like the spring birds. His English was clear, but carried the musical cadence of his native tongue. You bring trouble with you. Not by choice, Ephraim admitted, but we come seeking help, for the boy. At these words, Tawa's expression softened slightly. He turned his attention to Sage, who had also dismounted and stood straight despite her exhaustion. You are the singer, he said, the one who shares the child's blood. Yes. Sage's voice was steady. I'm Hannah's sister. I've come for Timothy, little Jed, as you call him. He speaks of you often, Tawa said. Sings your songs when he thinks no one listens. Tears welled in Sage's eyes, but she blinked them back. Before anyone could speak further, a small figure darted from between the lodges, running full tilt toward them. Aunt Sage! Aunt Sage! Little Jed crashed into Sage's skirts, wrapping his arms around her waist. She dropped to her knees, gathering him close, her composure finally breaking as she pressed kisses to his dark hair. The boy was small for 6 years old, with Hannah's bright blue eyes and a face that showed his father's Ute heritage. Oh, my precious boy, Sage whispered. I've missed you so much. Ephraim watched the reunion with a tightness in his throat. The boy's features struck him, the perfect blend of two worlds, innocent of the conflicts that divided them. In little Jed's face, he saw echoes of Sage's description of Hannah. The same determined chin, the same curious gaze. Tawa observed them all carefully before speaking again. Come. Night approaches and you look hungry. He gestured toward the camp. We will share food and talk of what brings you here. They followed him into the circle of lodges, leading their tired horses. Women worked at cooking fires while children played nearby, their games pausing briefly to study the newcomers. Little Jed kept one hand firmly wrapped in Sage's skirts, chattering about his life in the camp. The friends he'd made, the words he'd learned, the rabbits he'd helped snare. Inside Tawa's lodge, they settled around a small fire. His wife, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, served them stew in wooden bowls, rich with venison and wild onions. Little Jed curled up against Sage's side, content simply to be near her again. Bad men follow you, Tawa said after they had eaten. It wasn't a question. 5 riders, Ephraim confirmed. They wear false faces. One claims to be a preacher, another a lawman. They hunt the boy for his father's mining claim. Tawa's expression darkened. I know of this claim. The boy's father spoke of it before he died. Sage looked up sharply. Died? Hannah never knew what happened to him. Fever took him in the high country, Tawa explained gently. He reached our hunting camp too late for medicine to help. His last words were of Hannah and the child. He reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a folded paper. He left this, asking us to keep it safe until his son was old enough. The mining deed, the paper that had caused so much trouble. Sage took it with trembling hands, then quickly passed it to Ephraim for safekeeping. Little Jed watched them with solemn eyes, understanding more than a child his age should have to. We cannot stay long, Ephraim said. Those men will find this valley soon enough. Tawa nodded. You will leave at first light. I will guide you through the secret passes. He looked at little Jed with genuine affection. The boy has brought joy to our camp, but his path lies with his mother's people now. They spent the night in Tawa's lodge, wrapped in warm buffalo robes. Little Jed refused to leave Sage's side, as if afraid she might disappear again. She hummed softly to him, the hymns his mother had loved, until he drifted off to sleep. In the deep hours before dawn, Ephraim caught Sage watching her nephew's peaceful face in the dying firelight. He has Hannah's spirit, she whispered. So bright, so loving. I see her in every smile. You've done right by both of them, Ephraim assured her, getting him away from those men, keeping him safe. We're not safe yet. She touched the boy's cheek gently. But for the first time since Hannah died, I feel hope. Dawn came too quickly. The camp stirred to life as they prepared to leave. Tawa's wife pressed packets of dried meat and corn into their saddlebags. The children who had been little Jed's playmates came to say goodbye, speaking to him in their language while he answered in a mix of English and Ute words. Tawa mounted his own horse, prepared to guide them. "The spirits of his ancestors watch over him," he told Sage, as she settled little Jed in front of her on the saddle. "Both the ones who walked these mountains and the ones who sang your songs." The sun broke over the eastern ridges as they rode out of the valley. Little Jed waved goodbye to the only home he'd known for months. But his small face showed no fear, only trust in the aunt who had come back for him, and curiosity about the journey ahead. The pre-dawn air bit cold and sharp. Ephraim stood first watch outside their makeshift camp, scanning the darkness while Sage and little Jed slept nearby. Tawa crouched beside him, reading signs in the night that most men would miss. "They are coming," Tawa whispered, his head tilted toward the south wind. "5 horses, moving fast." Ephraim's jaw tightened. He had hoped for more time, but the pursuers had pushed hard through the night. "How long?" "Minutes." Tawa rose silently. "Wake them. I will delay the hunters." Inside the small clearing where they had stopped to rest, Ephraim gently shook Sage's shoulder. She woke instantly, alert from days of running. Little Jed stirred against her side, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "They're close," Ephraim said softly. "We need to move. Now." Sage didn't waste breath on questions. She gathered little Jed up while Ephraim quickly broke camp, scattering the cold ashes of their fire. The horses stamped nervously, picking up the tension in the air. The first shot cracked through the pre-dawn stillness like thunder. Little Jed flinched, but didn't cry out. Sage pulled him close as Ephraim boosted them both onto their horse. "Head north through the narrow pass," he instructed, checking his rifle. "I'll be right behind you." "Ephraim!" Sage started to protest. "Go." He gave her horse a sharp slap on the flank, sending them forward just as more shots rang out. Through the trees, Ephraim caught glimpses of the firefight. Tawa had positioned himself behind a fallen log, trading shots with the pursuers. The preacher's voice carried across the distance, full of false righteousness. "Give us the boy and the deed. No one else needs to die today." Ephraim mounted his own horse and spurred it after Sage, but not before squeezing off 2 careful shots to keep the hunters' heads down. He caught up to Sage at the mouth of the pass, a narrow defile between towering rock walls that would force them to ride single file. "Stay close to the right wall," he called out. "The footing's better there." They pushed their horses forward as fast as they dared. The pass was treacherous with spring snowmelt, streams of icy water cutting across their path. Little Jed clung to the saddle horn, his face pressed against Sage's back. Behind them, more shots echoed off the canyon walls. Ephraim twisted in his saddle for a backward glance. Through the gloom, he saw Tawa emerge from the trees at a gallop, 3 riders in pursuit. The other 2 must have split off, looking for another way around. Sudden fire blazed across Ephraim's left shoulder. The impact nearly knocked him from the saddle. He heard Sage cry out his name, but he forced himself to stay upright, to keep moving. Warm blood soaked his shirt, but he could still grip the reins. "Keep going," he shouted. "Don't stop." The pass widened slightly, allowing Tawa to catch up to them. The Ute Scout's face was streaked with powder burns, but his eyes were fierce and clear. "2 riders circle north," he reported. "They will try to cut us off at the valley junction." Ephraim nodded grimly. "Take the high trail at the split. We'll draw them down through the creek bed." Sage turned in her saddle, face pale with worry. "Your shoulder." "Just a graze," Ephraim assured her, though the pain suggested otherwise. "Keep riding." They emerged from the pass into gray morning light. The junction lay ahead, one trail climbing toward the ridgeline, another following a swollen creek down into the valley. Tawa peeled off without a word, his horse scrambling up the steep incline while Ephraim led Sage and little Jed down toward the water. The creek ran fast and deep with snowmelt, Their horses splashed through, sending up sheets of icy spray. Little Jed whimpered as the cold water soaked his legs, but he stayed quiet and brave. Sage murmured encouragement, one arm locked around him protectively. They followed the creek's twisting course, using its sound to mask their horses' movements. Ephraim's shoulder throbbed with each hoofbeat, but he forced the pain away, focusing on the trail ahead. He knew these valleys better than any man alive. Every hidden draw, every game trail, every sheltered hollow. A shot rang out from the ridge above, sending rock chips flying. Ephraim saw movement through the trees. The two flanking riders had indeed cut ahead of them. But even as he watched, Tawa appeared on the opposite slope, his rifle cracking. One of the riders tumbled from his saddle with a cry. "Almost there," Ephraim called to Sage. "Past that next bend, there's a hidden trail." They rounded the curve of the creek just as more shots kicked up spray around them. Ephraim reined hard left, guiding them into a narrow gap between two massive boulders. The trail beyond was barely visible. A game path he had used in his trapping days, following the contours of the land north toward his cabin. The going was slower here, the trail too rough for speed, but it offered better cover, and the pursuing horses would have trouble following three abreast. Ephraim's vision blurred occasionally from blood loss, but he forced himself to stay focused, to keep them moving. Behind them, he heard shouts of frustration as the hunters lost their trail. One voice, the deputy's, called out to spread out and search, but Ephraim knew they wouldn't find this path unless they already knew where to look. They rode through the morning hours, following the hidden trail as it wound through dense forest and across small meadows still patched with snow. Little Jed had fallen into an exhausted doze, secure in Sage's arms. She looked barely better herself, but her back stayed straight, her hands steady on the reins. Near midday, Tawa rejoined them, materializing from the trees like a shadow. "Two riders fell back," he reported. "The preacher and two others still follow, but their horses tire." Ephraim nodded. His own mount was stumbling more frequently, and the wound in his shoulder had settled into a deep, burning ache. "3 more hours to my cabin," he said. "We can rest the horses there, gather supplies." They pushed on through the afternoon, stopping only briefly to let the horses drink from clear mountain springs. The sun was setting by the time the familiar shape of Ephraim's cabin appeared through the trees. Smoke still rose from the chimney. The hunters must have used it as a base in their search. "Circle wide," Ephraim whispered. "Come in from the back." They approached cautiously, but the cabin stood empty, the interior cold. The hunters had moved on days ago, leaving only scattered beans and empty coffee cups as evidence of their stay. Ephraim helped Sage and Little Jed dismount, while Tawa took the horses around to the lean-to stable. Inside, Sage immediately set about building up the fire, while Little Jed huddled in a blanket, his small face drawn with exhaustion. Ephraim sank onto a chair, the room spinning slightly as the day's exertion caught up with him. "Let me see that shoulder," Sage said firmly, already gathering clean rags and water. He didn't argue, allowing her to help him out of his blood-stained shirt. The bullet had carved a deep furrow across his shoulder blade, but the bleeding had mostly stopped. Sage cleaned the wound with gentle hands, her touch careful, but sure. "Thank you," she said softly as she worked. "For everything today. For protecting us." Ephraim caught her hand, meeting her eyes. "I'll always protect you, both of you." A moment of understanding passed between them, deep and wordless. Then Little Jed's stomach growled loudly, breaking the spell. Sage smiled and turned to dig through their saddlebags for food. Tawa appeared in the doorway, his rifle ready. "I will take first watch," he said. "Rest while you can. They will find this trail eventually." Ephraim knew he was right. The cabin wasn't their final destination, just a brief respite before the next leg of their journey. But for now, watching Sage heat up beans while little Jed dozed by the fire, he allowed himself to feel a moment of peace. They had survived the day's chase. They were together, and they were safe for the moment. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, in this familiar cabin with these people he had grown to care for so deeply, Ephraim felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the warmth of belonging, of family. Outside, the mountain night settled in, stars appearing one by one above the silent trees. Inside, the fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the cabin's rough-hewn walls. Little Jed had curled up in Ephraim's old buffalo robe, his breathing deep and even. Sage sat beside him, humming an old hymn under her breath, while she mended a tear in his jacket. Ephraim stood watch by the window, his wounded shoulder aching but his heart full. Whatever came next, he knew with bone-deep certainty that he would give his life if needed to keep them safe. Not out of duty or obligation, but because somewhere along their desperate flight, they had become his to protect, his to cherish. Ephraim's cabin grew warmer over the next 2 days, not just from the crackling fire, but from the life that now filled it. Sage changed his bandages twice daily, her touch gentle as she applied the healing salve. The wound was clean, showing no signs of fever, though it left him favoring his right arm. Little Jed spent hours sprawled on his belly by the hearth, pushing around wooden animals Ephraim had carved years ago. His quiet play was punctuated by occasional giggles, when Sage would make the deer talk to the bear in funny voices. In the afternoons, Ephraim worked at his bench, carefully shaping pine boards into a small cradle. His shoulder protested, but the work gave him peace. He remembered the hymn book page Sage had left behind that first morning, now creased and worn. When the cradle was finished, he tacked the page above it, the words, "Whosoever shall believe," catching the lamplight. "It's perfect," Sage whispered when she saw it, her eyes bright. They fell into an easy rhythm. Sage learned to cook over the temperamental stove, producing golden biscuits that filled the cabin with their buttery scent. Ephraim showed her how to split kindling with the hatchet, guiding her hands until she found the right angle. Their fingers brushed, lingered, withdrew. In the evenings, they spoke in low voices while little Jed slept. Talk of spring planting, of fixing the roof, of perhaps building on another room. Simple dreams, but precious in their possibility. That night, they stood at the window watching fresh snow drift down, coating the pines in white silence. Little Jed was curled in his new cradle, clutching one of the wooden toys. Laughter from supper still echoed in the warm air. "Reckon we could make a real home here," Ephraim said softly. Sage's hand found his, squeezed gently. "I reckon we already have." The snow continued falling, each flake catching moonlight before settling into the peaceful night. 3 nights later, the peaceful darkness shattered. Ephraim jerked awake at the sound of breaking glass. Orange light flickered through the windows as flames licked up the outer walls. Smoke curled under the door. "Sage, get the boy!" he shouted, grabbing his rifle. The door burst open. 2 shadowy figures rushed in, silhouetted against the growing inferno outside. Ephraim swung his rifle like a club, catching the first man in the chest. The second attacker ducked under his guard. They grappled in the thickening smoke, knocking over chairs and supplies. "Run!" Ephraim yelled between coughs. He glimpsed Sage clutching little Jed, backing toward the rear window. A third man appeared behind them. The bounty hunter must have circled around while they slept, tracking them all this time. Sage screamed as rough hands seized her arms. "Ephraim, help us!" He turned at her cry, but something heavy cracked against the back of his skull. The cabin floor rushed up to meet him as darkness swept in. The last thing he heard was little Jed's terrified wails mixing with Sage's screams as they were dragged away into the night. Hours passed. Dawn's pale fingers reached through the smoky air, touching Ephraim's face where he lay amid the ashes of their home. He stirred, head throbbing, chest tight from the smoke. The cabin's remains smoldered around him, timbers reduced to charred bones reaching toward the sky. His fist was clenched around something. Opening his fingers revealed the hymn book page, its edges burned brown, the words, "Whosoever shall believe," barely legible through the soot. Blood from a cut on his temple had dripped onto the paper, staining the verse crimson. Ephraim pushed himself to his knees, every movement sending pain shooting through his bruised body. But the physical hurt was nothing compared to the hollow ache in his chest as he stared at the ruins of their brief happiness. Ephraim's body protested as he pulled himself onto his faithful mule. Every movement sent sharp pains through his bruised ribs, but determination burned hotter than his wounds. The gang's wagon had left deep ruts in the muddy spring earth, heading east toward Silver Bluff. He followed the tracks through greening valleys, stopping only when his mount needed rest. At night, he huddled under his horse blanket, chewing tough strips of dried venison. The lonely hours brought memories of Sage's smile, little Jed's innocent laughter, and the brief peace they'd found together. Those memories drove him forward, mile after weary mile. On the third morning, hoofbeats approached on the road. Ephraim's hand moved to his holster, but it was just a mail rider, his leather bags heavy with letters. "Saw some folk you might be looking for," the rider said, pulling his horse to a stop. "Preacher and his wife," they said, though the woman seemed mighty fearful for a bride. Had a small boy with them, too. They're headed to Silver Bluff for some kind of hearing. Ephraim's jaw tightened. "Much obliged," he managed, his voice rough from disuse. That night, as spring peepers chirped in the darkness, Ephraim did something he hadn't done since the war. He bowed his head and prayed. The words came slowly at first, rusty from years of silence. "Lord," he whispered, "I ain't worthy to ask favors, but that woman and boy need help. Give me strength to make this right." Stars wheeled overhead as he spoke into the night. Each prayer felt like a weight lifting from his shoulders, each mile bringing him closer to the reckoning that waited in Silver Bluff. The dried blood on his temple had crusted over, but his purpose was clear now, clearer than it had been in all his years of solitude. Dawn found him already in the saddle, following the rutted road east. The muddy tracks told their story. 2 wagons, 5 horses, heading toward judgment. The Silver Bluff courthouse buzzed with whispers as Preacher Brackett marched Sage down the center aisle. Her plain dress was wrinkled, her eyes downcast. Little Jed clung to her skirts, his small fingers twisted in the fabric. Deputy Marin stood near the judge's bench, his badge gleaming in the morning light that filtered through dusty windows. "Your Honor," the preacher's voice boomed across the wooden pews, "this woman stands in violation of her father's debt contract. Moreover, she was taken by that mountain man, Ephraim Cade, against Christian law and decent society." Sage's shoulders trembled, but she kept her silence. Her eyes darted to where little Jed sat, watched by one of the bounty hunters. The message was clear: speak up, and the boy would suffer. Deputy Marin stepped forward, adjusting his gun belt. "Can testify myself, Judge. Found evidence of their improper arrangements up in that cabin." The judge, a thin man with wire spectacles, peered down at the assembly. "What proof have you of these claims?" Preacher Brackett produced a leather folder with a flourish. "Here's the deed to the mining claim, signed over to cover her father's obligations, and these papers show her legal binding to our congregation's care." Outside the courthouse, townspeople pressed against the windows. Women in cotton dresses shook their heads. Men muttered about mountain folk and their wild ways. The spring morning had drawn a crowd eager for scandal, their judgment as heavy as the laws. Sage stood straight-backed through it all, her silence her only shield against their lies. The courthouse doors burst open with a thunderous crack. Ephraim Cade stood in the doorway, his clothes dust-covered and torn, face bruised but eyes blazing with purpose. In his weathered hand, he clutched a singed page from Sage's hymn book. "Your Honor," his voice rang clear despite his ragged appearance. "I come to speak truth before God and man." The crowd fell silent as Ephraim limped down the aisle. "I gave shelter to this woman in a storm, nothing more. The shame is mine for not protecting her better." He turned to face the assembly. "But the greater sin lies in this preacher's greed. He hunts not for justice, but for a dead man's gold claim that rightfully belongs to the boy." Sage stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. "He gave me shelter, not sin. These men burned our cabin to hide their lies." At that moment, Tawa appeared in the doorway, his presence commanding immediate attention. He carried worn leather papers, walking straight to the judge's bench. "These are the original deed papers," he said, laying them before the judge. "The ones the preacher holds were written by a false hand." The judge examined both documents carefully, his wire spectacles catching the morning light. After several tense moments, he looked up. "The fraud is clear. This case is dismissed. Miss Harland and the boy are free." The courthouse erupted in applause, the same townspeople who had whispered judgment now celebrating the mountain man's courage and truth's triumph over deceit. Spring painted the mountains in soft greens and wildflower colors. The sound of hammering echoed through the valley as Ephraim, joined by helping hands from town and his Ute friends, rebuilt the cabin log by log. Each timber raised felt like a victory over the winter's darkness. Near the fresh-cut window, Sage tended her small herb garden, the scent of wild mint rising in the warm air. Little Jed sat in the dirt nearby, making galloping sounds with the wooden horse Ephraim had carved for him. They gathered beneath the pine cross Ephraim fashioned from the old cabin's blackened beams. There, with mountain flowers in her hair, Sage became his wife. As evening settled over their new home, the three bowed their heads together in prayer. "He went hunting for meat," Sage whispered with a smile, "but God sent him a family." Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.